Alright, let's cut the nonsense. You already saw the title. Today is the day we get to dig back through the first generation of Pokemon games for a re-review. Yes, not just the originals with red and blue, but also yellow, because when else will I care to include it? Our goal, as always, is to critique the games with accuracy and of course never spread any form of misinformation. Totally. All to enact vengeance on my previous dissections of the Gen 1 experience. That frankly I'm not really remotely proud of at all. So yeah, red, blue, and yellow, but again, with that modern perspective view, because guess what? Did you really expect some kind of witchcraft to turn the clock back? While I wish that were possible for a more authentic take on the game, ultimately it doesn't even matter because the games haven't actually changed since release, just our perspective of them. So today, we're here to see the goods and the bads of the series as its roots before the series even took off, to see how far the games have come since, while potentially chuckling over some of the massive shortcomings that the game provides, as we're just glad that things got better with time, or it's just funny. Also, because the game likes flashing lights, here's a warning for those existing in the video. Sorry, that's just how it is. Anyways, let's start. Oh, lucky us, we get to start with the overworld side of gameplay. No way, how exciting. Although restraining us sadly in this analysis, we gotta start from the top. First game of a series business and whatnot. But to wrap it up as fast and concise as possible, you control a trainer on foot or bike and go from place to place, talking to NPCs, battling them, and eventually boss trainers, exploring more areas of the map, gaining new abilities in and out of battle, and as such to progressively reach that endgame trainer gauntlet and maybe stop an evil team along the way. That's the gameplay at its most dumbed down and the formula that's existed in all the games to follow to some extent. But what happens when we plug it into red and blue? Well, to start, we gotta look at the Kanto region itself, and here we get a decently designed world in terms of its layout, and everything else, not so much. We have a map that is decently open-ended, but only during various parts of the game. 4 real acts of the region's progression exists. The super linear section of Pallet Town through Mount Moon, super streamlined and impossible to get lost during for Act 1. The more open section of Act 2, granting minor freedom of choice progression, and a minor reward for exploring. This is the Cerulean City through the Navender Tower narrative sections. Then we reach the third section, where the real freedom of choice nonsense begins, granting you an extent of variety in terms of what to do next, essentially containing all of Silphco and the Saffron City Gym as a bit of a pair, alongside the Fuchsia City Gym in order to cross the sea to perform at Cinnabar Island, or you could also go do the things I just said. Again, it's the player choice. Guys, you don't understand. You pick what's next! Just like how that bit is overdone in the grand scheme of gaming, the freedom of choice itself is just exhausting, and in this game, a bit of a net negative due to the implementation to some extent that we'll see later. Bringing in another hyperlinear section as the 4th bit of the game, that's just really the 8th gym through the Pokemon League to end it all. We got roughly 2 kind of 3 side areas during the main game to explore to be rewarded handsomely for, exploring. Pack that with a single post-game exclusive area that sits in broad daylight during the main game, and we have a region that's pretty great conceptually. Just the execution is a bit slacking. Why that is mostly comes down to the general terrain being very repetitive, grassland, 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 cave, water route, grassland, bunch of cities, in a way that's more repetitive than most games. We have the actual gameplay offering brought by red, blue, and yellow, which we'll see in the gameplay section later, and then of course the biggest one being some questionable route designs, although that mainly just provides to the bottom right areas of the region, although the section's not alone, as other areas like the Cinnabar Mansion for instance are just silly because the puzzle requires you to just skip the first statue but take the first jump, skipping the trainer that you would expect to be mandatory. Alright, well that'll cover it for the actual land itself. What about actually trying to proceed through it? And that, of course, is another place where it gets a bit messy, because of this grand ambition called game design. As you'd expect in an RPG, talking to NPCs, boss battles, and most importantly collecting key items are all needed to actually progress in the game. The first 2 points are handled well enough, although the key item thing is standing in a bit of a position, as we get a few examples of that just being a bit sloppy in execution. The golden teeth, for instance, being a requirement, or even existing at all, is outlandishly stupid, because it's only a few feet away from something else that's of damn near equal value and also mandatory. And then of course, needless needlessly needing to exchange the teeth out for a progression item. And the requirement to enter Saffron City is just a bit silly in itself, because it just requires a regular generic item obtainable on some room that you would never really expect to explore if you were playing the game for the first time. And don't even get me started on the Sylph Scope. Something that's intended to be mandatory to pick up is just never mentioned to the player at all, and you just have to stumble across it in the game corner. How fun! And that's a bit of a problem we're gonna have to see for a running theme. First time being a trouble time, which in general leads to one of the more notable issues with Kanto, and being an over-reliance on exploring. In particular, the whole of Acts 1 and 4 don't really matter that much in this regard. Oh, an optional battle that you can miss, or your confusion to the purpose of this boulder, for instance. But the other sections of the game, fun. Of course, where the line in the sand is really drawn is HMs. Why did they think this was okay? These are special abilities that 3 of which are mandatory to beat the game. Those being the removal of trees, water travel, and rock pushing. The abilities to light up a single cave and fast travel do not actually matter at all whatsoever. This feature in itself is a neat concept, as it allows you to tie in your actual team to the battle movement, let them influence the world. While the idea is pleasant, the execution here is something that I'll have to get back to you on. Spoilers, not very good. However, outside the HMs for cut, the other 4 are hidden and require some sort of just magically knowing where to go find them type of behavior. Maybe you'll guess that something's on the other end of Route 2 from seeing an inaccessible area earlier. And Fly is just on an optional path along the way, which you might not even be taking. Which leaves us with the last 2, Strength and Surf. How thrilling, they're back. Are both needing you to go through the Safari Zone and explore on the same path, just to go to a random house with a sign to get the last thing. But note, we're ignoring the fact that you can potentially softlock yourself in this hypothetical situation where you have no money, ever, with no way to obtain more. But this shows a bit of an issue here to some extent. These mandatory pickups are just being too missable. Listen, it's a little bit tough, but it could be worse, as you could go through the work to fetch the thing, and the game just deciding to lock you out of picking up your prize. Yes, we have a very limited inventory system in these games, as your inventory can only ever carry 20 items across the board on your person at once. Anything from healing items to TMs to Pokeballs, or even more importantly, key items. If your inventory is full, you're just unable to pick up anything at all, backtracking to the storage to tuck the items away and not have to throw them out for no reason, potentially locking yourself out of certain features to repeat the process of a mediocre inventory system, or waste your items to free up some slots, or just simply selling the items for money, or just straight up throwing them out. While inventory management is typically a skill, sadly in these games, simply not the case. It is just an unfathomably obnoxious restriction, one that's very easy to fall victim to. So congrats to us, that's it for the out-of-battle nonsense. A region that's good in concept, but in execution, not that great. So let's shuffle away from this out-of-battle nonsense, as we actually get to go to the gameplay now, and I get the displeasure of explaining more basics. Yeah, great, we're at the fun part of the video where I have to dig through all the advancements that the new generation brings. And if you can't see the issue with that, it's again the issue of being first. The fact that I'm legally obligated to explain the systems in their entirety, even if I really don't want to. So unlike my original script, my 20 minutes of explaining everything, let's just try to summarize this a bit. Here we get turn-based combat, baby. You get up to 6 critters. The foe in question has potential teams of mons, or it could just be a wild encounter. Battles themselves are won by killing every last one of them, or for wild mons just catching or simply running away from them. Losing, on the other hand, is just a minor setback where you get mugged by the generic bird or the child, you get warped back to an earlier point in the game, and you're on your way. Wild mons essentially exist as potential tools for you to adopt, or as an EXP farm that you're currently 30 minutes in a deep dive of. These encounters at least have the benefits of being infinitely generating, with a gameplay system intact that allows every mon to technically be unique. So hey look, infinite content to some extent. But trainer battles are the quote real content. Potential teams of mons played with very pitiful AI that goes out of its way to make the game outlandishly easy sometimes. The AI's access to items and switching is beyond questionable as well, since they take place mid-turn instead of at the start of the turn like what the players have. To call this inconsistent and definitively bad would be a bit of an understatement to say the least. least. Stealing mons is sadly off the table, but leaving these obstacles unable to pay rent surely does give reason to partake in battles. Well, that wraps up the battle types. Battles themselves grant you multiple commands to perform in the game. Attacking because making progress is mandatory, items to make the battles freer than hitting the subscribe button is, and switching because maybe going all or nothing on a single mon isn't worth it, because strategy actually does exist. Cool, that's the battling system skeleton, but if you thought we were slowing down, I regret to inform you that Pokemon sure are a thing that exists. These assortments of pixels are all special in some form or fashion with their tools of typing, stats, movesets, and level up growth rates. Attacks potentially carrying bonus effects or lots of damage, or no damage in up to 3 categories, 2 of which are not built equal at all. Physical attacks pull off the attack stat to apply pressure on a foe's defense. The special moves get used on the special stat to break the foe's special stat itself for some reason. Listen, I get it. You don't see the vision. Mewtwo really needs that fat special stat for offense and defensive purposes. Which, hey look, that's our segue to stats. Here we have 5 stats that are uniquely spread upon all the critters among the game. HP, attack, defense, special, and speed. So while the special stat is blatantly overpowered here for the reason I just explained, essentially being 2 stats in one, speed here also gets somewhat of a similar edge, as not only does it decide turn order, but it even adds to critical hit rates. So instead of that damage doubling chance being rare and hype, it's common and could happen all the time by exploiting it. Cool, time for something different. Typings exist in order to give the gameplay a glorified rock, paper, scissors approach, being mostly responsible for Mon's movesets, but particularly their defensive profiles and threat levels. Sometimes, again, stats do this better than typings do. Offensively, this little acronym here gives boosts to Mons using attacks of their own typing, allowing for more offense to be had, but through taking advantage of what the Mon specializes in. Defensively, so much more value is had though, because attacks have effectiveness that do more or less damage to targets, but only if the type resists or is weak to the attacks. This is what we call type matchups, all of which is on this big old illegible mess of a chart that is never explained to you in game, but you just have to learn through trial and error. Our first iteration on the type chart is a bit rough around the edges, having a few interactions that were thankfully improved once gold and silver were reached. The obvious standouts are the like of fire taking a neutral damage from ice, bug and poison both being effective against one another and sadly never again. Poison especially needs it, alongside the abysmal coding error that is psychic being immune to ghost. Not that it actually matters because nobody's unironically using lick. Which leads to the unquestionable dominance of the normal and psychic types. They both have far too little drawbacks offensively, and defensively, they may as well not have any weaknesses at all in practicality, due to this gen's sloppy handling of the threats that are supposed to dispatch them. While the type matchups themselves seem simplistic, that packed with the whole physical special thing are where things really begin to take fold and are a bit of a mess, because those categories are determined by the move's typing, meaning every fire type attack, for instance, is special. Something like Fire Punch and Flamethrower are on the same side of the spectrum, which of course leads to obvious issues, like Hitmonchan, for instance, being unable to deal damage with its coverage moves, because of course the mon wasn't made to click special buttons. Another issue here, that types just generally need less moves of their variety, because why would they need to add more bug type attacks when they're all physical anyways? Rhetorical question, because we do need more attacks, and this game fumbles in that department very heavily. Since we're already here with the attacks, this is where we finally get to loop back to HMs. As mentioned earlier, these are mandatory attacks needed to progress in the game. The issue is the fact that these attacks have to be taught to your mons, meaning you gotta give up whole move slots that are intended to make your mons actually good in order to go places and fast travel, arguably the most important feature in the entire game. It wouldn't be the biggest sin if only 2 of these attacks weren't the only usable ones, leaving 3 as dead weight, arguably 2. But the kicker, however, is the fact you're not actually able to get rid of these attacks once you're done with them. Regular attacks, of course, can be taught over whenever you get new ones learned on the mon. Here, though, we have this intentional design to prevent you from getting soft locked, but in all actuality, it just ends up wasting move slots on the mon you're using, which leads to the plan of just grabbing unrelated junk mons for the role and benching your precious mons instead. Because why would you want to give up your super valuable move slots on your team members if it's just going to be a permanent problem later? Well, you can carry around a temporary problem instead. Because of this feature, the only way you can even get rid of these attacks in the first place is by quite literally just trashing them on entirely and starting anew, which I don't need to explain why that's an issue, it's pretty obvious. Also, speaking of attacks, one extra effect that can come out of them is status conditions. These are are effects that need to be healed off the mons or they'll be handicapped by it. These are non-stackable and add strategy to the game, mainly in how to abuse it. Paralysis being an RNG machine disabling critters sometimes while cutting the mon's speed. Burn with passive damage, cutting the attack stat. Freeze just flat out KOs a mon because it renders them completely useless until they're KO'd, or the status is forced removed from eating a fire type attack, which never happens. Sleep also temporarily disabling mons, but the status can go away naturally in battle, although at the cost of your turn so you can go back to bed. And finally, Confusion. Another RNG fest, but this one can be stacked with the others for max suffering. The difference here is, if you lose your turn, you're taking damage for it. While they can be annoying, they all add a degree of fun and again, strategy that the experience would be much worse without, even if the execution here is a bit tough. Congrats, we're through attacks, meaning Nito, we get to go full circle back to stats. As to make each and every mon unique, the DV system exists, essentially being unalterable stat values that are determined when a mon is encountered, that can improve or hinder a mon's ability. It's a neat idea, the problem is it's luck to get free stats that are always better to have, especially for PvP play. In concept, it's a fun feature. In execution, it's just completely inaccessible, and sometimes not very thrilling. EVs, on the other hand, are a separate system for stats to make mons succeed in such a harsh environment. EVs are earned when knocking out Pokemon alongside getting EXP, but these are invisible numbers added to a critter that eventually goes off to earn them additional stats, eventually adding up to an additional 63 stat points for an individual stat, potentially for all of them, meaning no way a second reason to grind, and again, super needed for peak potential critters, although there's actually an upside to this system that the modern systems do not have. In any game past Ruby and Sapphire, you actually have to go out of your way to specifically pick out what stat values you want by fighting certain things. Here though, you just fight things and you eventually get all the stats you need. Only being a hassle in the time department, but come on, levels are that already. Which means, hey look, not leveling, but more battling nonsense. Because as a reward for game progression through the gym challenge, you get badges to mark your progress, and for some reason, all of which have minor gameplay quirks attached. Half of these will actually end up influencing stats through a badge boost, essentially just being a passive multiplier boosting stats more. Some of them allow HMs to be used in the overworld as a failsafe against HMs on mons being gotten through trades to delay their use for when it's actually intended in the game. And the last thing we need to do is have no gym badges and surfing over to Cinnabar Island. And the other quirk actually plays into a terrible feature of obedience, essentially putting in an awful RNG based system that can potentially make mons received from trades just not function at all or be total liabilities. Here level caps get added to make that stop happening entirely, which while we're here, I guess we could leave the battle scene because wow, no way, trading? Get this. It's a feature to encourage communicating with others, or select NPCs because people avoid you like the plague, and unlike them, they're here forever. This lets you send a mon over to someone else or their mon to get stuff that's potentially otherwise unobtainable, or if you just want the gameplay edge of an extra XP multiplier they receive because grinding bad. Only downside here is if you didn't catch the critter yourself, you won't be able to name it at all. So, you're bad, plus plan the stuff out, plus stop using Farfetch'd. Wait a second, using mons? Hey look, a bad transition in the team building in the box system. So as a basic feature, you can only have up to 6 mons on a team at any given point in time. Okay, that's not too bad. Any more and battles would go on for too long, unless just not as good. But this team limit gives you constraints to build teams in, making for a fun exercise of picking thing, getting them, and using them. We have a few problems with it though. The HMs as mentioned already come in and restrict the mons themselves with what they can do. Otherwise, you don't get to explore anything. The second one is the EXP system. Yes, beating mons to level them up is an issue. Of course, beat thing, get numbers so it adds up to make the critter's level increase. A level up gives more stats and attacks to the fella you're over investing in. Cool, that's what it do, but why is it an issue? Well, it's the way EXP earned is calculated. So here is essentially the EXP calculation formula that I'm copying and pasting because I don't want to type it out again. The sense it makes doesn't really matter. The effect it has does. One mon fighting one mon, they get all the XP and everything else you have gets nothing. But switching mons in and out of battle against a singular foe will end up splitting the EXP earned between the mons that join the fight club. While this is fine in the battle scene for like leveling up teammates and whatnot, the problem is, the fact this is a hypothetical situation, because this is assuming the foes you'd fight would actually have good EXP yields, which this game's spam of unevolved mons all over the place does a horrible job at having, just bogging down EXP gained. This sadly ends up up snowballing pretty hard, as using new mons, especially in the early game, just ends up being very painful. Switch training non-stop until they can eventually fend for themselves, and then needing to backtrack between the Pokemon Center every 1 or 2 battles is just a self-fulfilling prophecy of suffering. Of course, just being a massive time loss. Oh boy, ladies and gentlemen, grinding is here, and it's sadly essential if you want to make your mons valuable. Or, you know, just ditch them at the first point possible for something that's a higher level. You know what, dude? Play the game how you will. That's the entire point of it. But sadly, this ends up making the upkeep of mons that you want to use more time-consuming, punishes you for even playing the game the way you wanna. You know, unless the way you wanna is just running a singular mon through the game. But oh wait, what about the EXP all item? That thing's crazy broken. Is what you would think if you've never actually used it. It splits the XP between every mon in the back evenly, so they basically got nothing. And while the mon you're using isn't getting that awful split, it's still getting more than what they're getting, meaning your team is probably gonna be solo run material, which sadly ends up making this item damn near useless, which is something I genuinely don't give Gold and Silver enough credit for fixing. But our third team building issue, because yeah, we were counting these, remember, is the box system itself, because it's bad. And yes, we can acknowledge that it's a hardware issue, but it does not remove the fact that it's an issue at all, alright? Essentially, here we have a storage system accessible from any healing location in the game, allowing you to pull mons in and out of your team, even with the option to send them to the Shadow Realm. You get a total of 240 slots, which is more than you're probably ever going to need. The issue is the way it's divided up. 20 slots divided by 12 boxes. The way the system works in this game is you'll end up having to save on a certain box screen. The issue is, though, if your current box that you saved on is packed with mons, you are simply not allowed to attempt to catch anything in battle, period. Meaning those static encounters very well could be lost forever, needing the game to be restarted and some backtracking to fix a minor mistake. But the simple fact that mons just don't heal when they get posited into the PC is just a bit of an inconvenience. All these issues slowly but surely drag you down across the span of a game, leading you closer to an aneurysm in some form or fashion, which finally brings us to the last mechanic, evolution. Essentially, from hitting certain requirements, either leveling, using specific evolutionary items, or trading, will allow a mon to evolve into a stronger one, essentially allowing mons to get way stronger by becoming something else entirely. Wow, man, how cool. Anyways, let's move on to the actual experience the game offers, because yeah, I need to escape this section as soon as humanly possible. In terms of the replayability factors in the original games, as expected, it's a bit limited, but what could you do in such a case? So where better else to start than the Pokemon lineup? As you'd expect from the first set of games, everything is available, but sadly not really. For a first, the game provides 151 Pokemon across the board. The quality of said selection is very questionable, and honestly could be torn into at a different time. So one of those mons is an event-only encounter, meaning you'll likely never get it, or shouldn't be able to. One legendary ends up being post-game, whatever, it's insanely busted anyways, which leaves us with our count of 149 mons to interact with during the main game. For our usual counting, that is. Red and Blue, like most other Pokemon games to follow, aren't so simple when it comes to actually catching the funny critters. The biggest restriction is the series' flagship of version exclusives, a feature I would totally never take for granted and just forget about it the last time I talked about Red and Blue. Totally not! But essentially, this ends up being the difference between the two games, is the fact that some battles between the two may have different mons in their teams, but particularly the wild Pokemon in the game will not be the same, allowing variety between the two games for you to gather, making both of them at least stand out in some form or fashion. The entire Pokedex is not subject to this. Loads of them are shared between the two, because inherently that means there's less mons in the game to use, without trading that is, restricting the experience to add more uniqueness, so making the game worse in order to sell the same game twice. Meaning we have another 11 mons to knock off our count. Take out another 2 for the fossil that you're not getting in the run. Take out 6 for the starters, but I mean, I guess there's a line you can fight. Take out potentially another 4 because of trade evolutions. And I guess you could technically remove the 4 in-game trade exclusive mons, but I mean, we're reaching at this point. Leaves us with roughly 130 mons to get during the game. Meaning, hey look, variety, even if a bit restricted. Oh boy, did I just say restricted? That's great considering the mon's actual quality in the HMs. Eating away a move slots to make team building more and fun. But remember, while this does sound like a negative, it's Pokemon we're talking about. Like, we can sit here and talk about balancing all we want. Your customization is still good. It's just more limited than we would like. So congrats, we get to pivot from your Mon to faux Mons, as of course, you need something to build a team for. So for trainers, we can quickly just skip over the generic trainers from routes, dungeons, and gyms, due to their real note of value coming later. As for now, bosses and why their teams may or may not work. And in terms of gym leaders in particular, outside of Sabrina's team not matching the self-imposed rule of all monotype teams, the Mons themselves are honestly fine. Although the one example of repetition isn't pleasant, it's passable. Although it stops being passable once the Elite Four gets dragged into question, where things get worse in the Mons department. As for some reason, Bruno has two non-fighters that both just happen to be the same Pokemon, you know, a really bad one that was also on the first boss fight in the game. Agatha comes in with a dupe and just not having a full ghost team. Although technically it's an all poison team, so it's theoretically still passable, even though they just put it off as the ghost type trainer. Although that does not fix the quality of her team. Holy hell, look at it. Still, half of these Mons are frankly pathetic for a member of the game's final gauntlet. And of course, there's Lance with his two unevolved dupes, and of course, not a full team of dragons or flyers. Although, with the context of these games, how could you expect Dragon to be here with only one evolution line? Oh wait, that also applies to Agatha. Crazy how that works. But for those curious, Lorelei and the rival are both pretty good, generally speaking, in terms of the team department. Although I can sit here and question why there's a Route 1 bird on the champion team. While that covers the Mons themselves, the moves are the true thorn in the boss trainer side, as no matter where it is, most of the Mons on these teams have full-blown level up movesets. And for regular trainers, this is essentially what makes them irrelevant and even more mind-numbing to battle than they otherwise should be. But for bosses, it's a death sentence that makes them not feel like bosses outside of their level jumps, and the reasoning of because the game said so. Take the Gyarados on the rivals team and Lance's team for instance. They have the exact same moveset, meaning there's nothing special here at all between the two, in a series defined by its customization. The same can apply to both of Bruno's Onyxes, Agatha's first Gengar and her Haunter, Lance's Dragonairs, Koga's Coughings, Blaine's Ponyta and Rapidash. All the same, with no sense of identity. Some Mons, however, like the Champion's Exeggutor being the biggest highlight, as it is stuck without a full moveset on the final battle of the game, with the most damning highlight being the Nugget Bridge rival with an unusable Abra. Now, custom movesets, while I'd argue is flat out mandatory for quality battles just period, they sadly had an entire brick dropped on them as a concept, as custom movesets are in the game, but they're super limited in distribution. Not only in distribution though, but in terms of what's actually custom, as they only swap out a single move on a Mon for something different, or they fill the rest of the attacks out with nonsense. So most of the time, giving a Mon an attack that's actually better, unless it's Sabrina's Alakazam, which feels like an attempt at balancing it out. Game freaking balancing? Since when? Is what I would say if they didn't for some reason decide to nerf Agatha's Golbat by taking away Bite and giving it an attack that is just inferior to something it already had. Unfortunately though, the Mons that get the special treatment are an incredibly short list, but essentially all the Mons with custom movesets would include all of the aces on the main boss trainer teams. So you know, the strongest Mon they have level-wise. And a few specifics that I would totally never forget to spend another 20 minutes comparing movesets to even notice they exist in the first place. That lineup of one move being different includes Tower Rivals Gyarados, Silphco rivals Gyarados as well by technicality, the Rhyhorns used by Giovanni 3 and Rival 7, Bruno's Hitmonchan, Agatha's Golbat, and finally the Champion's Pidgeot. These Mons all got something very minuscule in terms of making them far less forgettable, despite the fact they're really not much for standouts in the first place. You know, alongside the obvious factoid the rest of their movesets being completely abysmal, which if you can maintain decent leveling through the game, this makes Red and Blue frankly the easiest game single-handedly in the entire series. And when under-leveled, the AI and the horrible movesets still make miracles happen somehow. Look, we could go on all day about the quality of movesets, as I haven't even repeated my bashing of the Champions right on yet, but because reading is easy, I think we'll have to leave it here and peak the leveling that I just mentioned. Spoiler, the level curve is bad. As we'll see for any Pokemon game not named Colosseum, we start at level 5, and we'll need to work our way through the game. After a tutorial, you get an optional rival battle, which you would need to grind for if you want to immediately try it, and and 4 other trainers between you and the first gym leader, which has a level 14 mon. And I'll go ahead and state the obvious here. You're going to have to grind immediately if you want to reasonably beat this if you pick not Squirtle. And it's messed up because you're probably not even 20 minutes into the game yet. This issue is compounded with the fact that the first gym leader is a rock type, meaning that most options to approach the fight are just outlandishly unreasonable to use. The simple fact that a grass starter can't sweep the battle in seconds because you didn't spend 20 minutes grinding is just outrageous and not worth ranting about again. Yes, even Charmander somehow gets off better than it. Sure, it serves as a tutorial, kind of, but that's just assuming you don't get stuck in bind loop for an entire battle. From Route 3 through Cerulean City, the level curve is honestly fine-ish. The only level here is how much this section emphasizes the value in its optional trainers. Misty herself ends up capping at 21, but you still do have content to do, should you still need the levels in the first place. Or even more trainers if you really wanted to. 24 to Surge is very tame and fine, although at this point afterwards, we see an issue with the gym leader teams begin to appear. That being an annoying level gap on mons from the same team. In this case, the Pikachu that is 6 levels lower than Surge's Raichu. Erica afterwards hits 229 peaks after going through Rock Tunnel, and maybe the Rocket Hideout in Lavender Tower if you really wanted to. Which is funny because for a bad level curve, the first half of the game's actually kind of fine, ignoring the Brock part. Afterwards, though, the game starts to fall apart a bit. As after Lavender Tower, your replayability boosting game design has an issue, where you could choose to go to Saffron City and do the self-co stuff to funnel yourself immediately towards Sabrina. Here, we get a level jump of a whopping 14 levels from where Erica was. This jump, even if you try to milk self-co for as many trainers as possible, just simply does not work. Again, assuming you're running teams of 5 to 6 mons. All these trainers, and they're hardly worth a damn, as unless the generic trainer, unless they have a single mon on their team, everything they have is doomed to be below level 30. With one exception, but of course that's a mandatory trainer, which granted the battles with the rival and Giovanni simply exist, is completely unacceptable. But don't stress, if it's too frustrating, you can ditch the path you chose and work towards battling Koga, which in itself has 2 paths to reach. The west path has you going down Cycling Road, and it abides by Silphco's leveling rules, minus the part where you battle 2 boss trainers, so everything's pitifully leveled. Although the east path duration-wise is much longer, trainers on Route 12 all end up being below level 30 for some asinine reason. Route 13 does almost the same thing with the exception of the Poliwag trainer. 14 shows up as this area's second mon 30 or higher, and 15 is more of the same. Nothing over here ever gets above 33. The difference is just the abundance of trainers and nothing really else. Congrats, you're at the Fuchsia Gym, and I got bad news. Because from Erica to Koga level-wise, it's a 14 level jump. Yes, gamers, it's the same as Sabrina. Progression is truly dead, and you just have to suck it up. Now, after grinding for an extensive period of time, or just magically beating Koga, maybe even both of them, you shove off to Cinnabar Island and battle a whopping 0 mandatory trainers before the next gym to do an easy puzzle and pull up to Blaine's crib. Here, he caps at 47, a jump the available trainers again fail to account for. Also, the rest of the levels on his team are a complete joke. Afterwards, you get to immediately shove off to Viridian's gym for a similar effect, where we see a level 50 on the same team with a mon that's at least 8 levels lower than it for some reason, before needing to do a bit of a grind for the Elite 4 run, capping at 65. Remember, if you really want to, you can do any of the gyms from Surge to Blaine in any order you'd like, with the exception of Koga being mandatory for Blaine, but because these levels are set in stone, this only unfortunately will amplify the leveling issues that you're dealing with when you're battling 40s plus before running back to Surge for his level 18 Pikachu. Again, from gyms 2 to 4, it's pretty decent, but the late game and the start really just don't work under any capacity and drag the game down to a crawl. People always talk about how grinding's mandatory, and it's like, yeah, kind of. And unfortunately, grinding's just so appealing, because not everyone just wants to sit here and spam items for an entire battle, which is really awful considering the execution of the game's horrible EXP system alongside some of the leveling issues that the wild encounters have. And rounding out this section, I actually had a small section on glitches, but we can actually sum it up very easily with bountiful yet avoidable, adding lots of unnecessary fun flavor to the game. So gamers, that's it for Red and Blue, which means bad news. I gotta do this again, but for Yellow. And sadly, unlike Crystal to Gold and Silver, I'm not able to just copy and paste everything to fit here. Alright, if you were there the last time I went on about Pokemon Yellow's shortcomings, you'll already know how this ends. Worse than Red and Blue. At first glance, that's ludicrous to even think about, but of course, it's something we're diving into now. So where else to start but the game's identity itself? Pikachu. This mon is the game's starter now, for worse or for worse. No, I didn't misspeak. There's no choice to help in replayability for you here. And to make matters even worse, you're just shoved onto a Pokemon that is instantly set up for failure. It cannot evolve, so your starter is disqualified from probably the most important feature for an early game tutorial mon, much less the one you start with. And this issue of bad only proceeds to snowball once the trainers get involved, particularly the first gym, as you are doomed, as it's essentially impossible to do anything of value with it here alone. No, not even a reasonable amount of grinding will save you. An unreasonable amount will, but an unreasonable amount will always save you. You either go all or nothing in levels to threaten the next gym alongside potentially wasting an hour of your time, or the foul cycle of catching something else and painfully grinding it up via switch training to handle one gym to box it immediately every single time you want to play the game, before finally doing whatever you please along the way. Again, whether you're grinding or using something else, guess what? You're still going through mind-numbing grinding, just being a brutal roadblock that makes the early game more insufferable than it already was, which says a lot considering the Brock battle was made even easier in this game with lower levels. Sure, well that's how much the starter ruins the early game. The question of what's even unique about the Pikachu should still be on your mind. Well, this includes the essentially useless feature of it following you around in the overworld. And no, the updated movesets they learn from level up do not actually matter since other mons get it as well. This lack of traits is simply not good at all. It makes mentioning the starter very worthwhile to save yourself the headache, both short term and long term. But our Pokemon problem doesn't end here, as due to being a third improved version, you know they had to remove the version exclusives as a feature, right? Well, that's what I would say if I were lying. But why the hell would they ever give us a single complete game? Yes, the crime that is version exclusives still linger in what is supposed to be a definitive experience. Look, it's not that big of a deal despite the odd selection of mons chosen, which, reference or not, an issue is an issue. But guys, it's not an issue at all. You can get all three of the Kanto starters in one run! That's so cool! Don't you love having all three normal and generic, not special Pokemon on the same save? To nobody's surprise, this is not worth any of the game's other drawbacks for what is essentially a novel concept you're giving arbitrary power to. No gamers, these are not 3 team slots that are reserved by default, but just by stubbornness. Okay, look, I'm not gonna sit here and control how you play the game or anything, but y'all are giving this way more power than it actually warrants for some pretty mediocre Pokemon. Although positively for the most part, the distribution of mons in general have been altered a wee bit to make some critters gotten even earlier or later in contrast to the originals, usually improving the encounter tables across the board, unless it's Cerulean Cave where the encounters are worse by a mile. Don't worry guys, Mewtwo's not the only post-game mon anymore. The legendary Lickitung joins it this time, finally getting the recognition it deserves. Okay, jokes aside, if you actually wanted to get all 151 mons in Yellow itself, not only would you need a copy of Red or Blue, but both. Meaning completing the dex here costs even more money and time than it would in Red or Blue because of a few of those exclusives missing from Yellow or shared with the other two, meaning 100% of the game is even more dreadful. And while I might be complaining about it now, this is still better than what they did with the Gen 4 National Dex. Source, I'm talking through experience. The ripples of this decision here end up making those a complete nightmare later on, but tangents aside. Gamers, them's the issues with the mon selection. But when we get to teams and whatnot, the will to play this game diminishes at a much faster pace. The boss trainers is where we'll start, and sadly the teams themselves are worse. Brock and Misty thankfully have the same mons, so there's no problem here at all. Again, Brock needed his level drop, which is good. However, the devs thought the game was too difficult, so they decided to devolve Erica's poison types, and Blaine even loses some filler on his team for a more quality over quantity approach. Those 4 are the good parts of the team departments. While you might be thinking, wow, that's not that big of a deal. After all, third improved versions love changing teams quite a bit. But obviously I delayed the failures of the teams for a reason. They've at least got one massive glaring issue each. So first, Giovanni. Actually, this one's not that big of a deal, but they do end up breaking their self-imposed rule of a monotype team in order to make a reference. Honestly, granted Red and Blue's exception on the same rule, this may may as well just be a non-issue. Sabrina's team is simplified to just being the Abra line. Honestly, a smart decision granted how busted they are, but the issue comes down to Abra's moveset. Yep, completely incapable of any forms of damage. Surge needlessly sheds the rest of his team to exclusively use the evolved form of your benchwarming starter in a battle that could work if there were actual gimmicks attached, otherwise being a 2-turn win in the feeling of nothing, which sadly leaves us with Koga. And wow, they completely ruined his team. Such a mediocre team with 3 unique mons, degraded to nothing more than 3 unevolved bugs with a mon adopted off Sabrina's team from the originals. This team sucks beyond words for a boss trainer in the damn mid-game. Like, it's genuinely pathetic. The only saving grace here is the mons having custom movesets, despite all of them having toxic and psychic for some repetitive reason, which leaves us with the rivals teams. Yes, teams. As tipping the scales, we get different rival teams, one for each EV evolution based on your performance in your first 2 rival battles, granting a drop of replayability in a Dryad Oasis. It's neat, but it's not fixing any of the game's issues, especially considering Red and Blue technically gave the rival 3 different teams. Although something aiding this department for trainers was something I kind of glossed over and we're going to look at now: the boss trainer mons with their custom movesets, meaning many of the mons that repeat throughout the game will have a tad bit more uniqueness among them, letting boss trainers feel more like boss fights instead of having mons equal in quality to that of a randomizer. And for generic trainers, slight level bumps and even some areas having more or less, although that's not guaranteed. But essentially, it's nothing to majorly assist in actually making the game better to play through, although ultimately the biggest issue lies outside of a very small selection of battles. The game's main offering is just too samey for the most part. Absolutely more unique than Crystal ever tried to be, sure. Meaning, yes, for Yellow, this is sadly another L for the game to hold, as the game's problems add up to make Red and Blue more tolerable despite being troubled itself. But Mr. Yellow isn't that bad though. True, that's because we haven't touched the level curve yet. Okay, so get this. In a game that's already stupidly demanding for EXP gain, they lowered the levels exclusively on Brock's team, as already mentioned, and they didn't touch it on Misty's. Then they proceeded to bump Surge up by 4, because the 1-mon rule. Erica gets 3 levels on all of her mons. Koga and Sabrina and Blaine get their levels increased by 7, and Giovanni by a measly, minuscule 5. Before even leading into a boss fight is even lower level-wise than the last gym leader you just beat. Why? The reason is drugs. It's always drugs. All this does is turn the game into more of a grind fest after already having done so for your worthless starter, proceeding to make the mid-game and late game even more miserable to play through. Because yes, you will unfortunately get stat checked. Yeah, the horrible trainer AI can't ruin that. Usually anyways. And this is just ignoring the fact that these gym leader level jumps, when compared to the gym trainers, the route trainers, still struggling in the same level ranges, with the same pitiful mon diversity, not even really attempting to address the issues at all, but rather making the extremes much higher. The regular trainers become even less of obstacles. I mean, I guess the Elite Four is a little bit easier to transition to level-wise, but at that point I just feel like I'm reaching. But of course, to close this out, one final section. We have mentioning of in-game trades. Why? Because get this, they're worse as well. In Red and Blue, there was a real reason to use this feature. For the mons, because there were 4 mons exclusively found through this way. In Yellow though, it's just the Mr. Mime trade for exclusive mons. And technically, for players without friends, they could also get Machamp as well, if you want to deem that as an exclusive, which it's not. But to spit in your face and shove fecal matter down your mouth, we gotta mention the Route 11 trade that wants a post-game mon for something you can just get with ease. If you had your doubts in the game generally being the worst experience, don't let the devs spit in your face of a Dugtrio trade go without resentment or a laugh or the consumption of toilet cleaner. It's just an insult. Sure, the trades in Red and Blue were kind of mediocre, half of them just were essentially valueless, but here it's just a twisted joke at best. An over-exaggeration a little, but it's needed to make the vision more clear. One of dread. The verdict on this mess of a game? Just play Red and Blue instead. Or, any other Pokemon game for that matter. The biggest issue with coming first means the game's content outside the main experience is essentially non-existent. The game's post-game content is as barren as only being a cave with wildly leveled Pokemon. Yep, that's it. The Pokemon League itself can be rematched, although the teams are the same. It's only like this because no other trainers in the game can be rematched at all. This is in fact all you have for content outside of trainers you may have missed or wild encounters, which really sucks as that's all there is for post-game. One actual feature, if you can even call it that, which is frankly an embarrassment. Thankfully though, there is some side content to see, although for the most part it's nothing game-changing. So with the features, we don't have much, but the first is the Game Corner. Game Freak was trying to hook kids on gambling at a young age. Oh boy, did it work. No guys, I'm not addicted, you just don't see the vision. But essentially, you get a money bag and you can pay for coins using your limited supply of money. It keeps the gambling going, because you know you want to get them big payoffs. Regardless, you can exchange it for some useful items or Pokemon. The Safari Zone is another feature reaching into your pockets, which is mandatory during the main game. You'll end up going on a catching adventure strapped down with a set supply of balls against a step counter, hoping in the name of Lady Luck that the game won't waste your time with fleeing mons or ones that won't spawn at all. There's plenty of exclusive encounters here, and that's pretty neat. And catching the mons is just designed a bit different, so you know what? It's cool, it's different, it's unique. The Pokemon Daycare is a thing that actually allows you to fetch EXP for your mons if you deposit them here, granting you 1 EXP point for every step you take in walking around in the overworld, making it the worst but sometimes valuable grinding method, you know, if money's something you can depart with. Funnily enough, if a mon levels up to learn an attack, it'll automatically overwrite the topmost attack with the new one, which could be a massive inconvenience if not accounted for, or a tool to actually remove HMs. Unfortunately, Game Freak outsmarted your outsmarting and made sure that was impossible. As you can see, the mon cannot be deposited at all. But wait, we're not done yet. Pokemon Yellow in particular has this Surfing Pikachu minigame that's inaccessible without external means. I mean, that's gotta account for something, right? Yeah, it's a neat distraction you'd be lucky to play for longer than 5 minutes. Is it fun? A little, but it doesn't really matter too much. Make Pikachu jump and do sick tricks. There's essentially nothing to gain from playing it outside of enjoyments. Also, fishing! I don't know if I can count this as an extra feature, but hey, more wild encounters. How fun. The last bit we have here is the multiplayer features. Yes, the biggest selling points of the series, or the other one. Essentially granting 2 players either the ability to battle one another for some fun competitiveness, or trading mons among themselves, because you know, getting around bad game mechanics to have mons that you couldn't have alone? Pretty nice! Now these are some damn good features, easily being highlights of the game's entire offering. Only really being a bummer to scam you into getting the same game twice, because the amount of friends you have is equal to the amount of people who like this video. 0! Yeah! And unless you want to fix that. Overall, wow, this game lacks anything outside of its main experience, pretty much forcing you to a game to play through multiple times. And as we've seen, Red and Blue struggle with that, and Yellow somehow manages to do it worse, despite that seemingly being impossible. When it's bad, it always gets worse. But is it possible to dig that pit further? Yes. Yes, the games do. Okay, let's just pull the band-aid off. In both the visual and graphical departments, the Gen 1 games fail to be pleasing in most manners. The graphics are self-explanatory. It's in fact a certified Game Boy moment if there's ever been one. They work to an extent, the overworld is frankly pathetic, but functions. Although the battle scene's actually a bit better. But whether it's in color or out of color, the mons as a whole look very off. And wow, I didn't think it was possible for me to hate color in a game before Yellow. As Gen 1's color, the in-battle scene looks fine. It's out of battle where things fall apart. While it's a neat concept that the colors match the names of towns alongside fit with the other areas because names, the issue is simply the colors being bad on the eyes, which sucks as it's the only real color the game can provide, which overall leads to an experience that's not visually pleasing. But of course, it is a Game Boy game, so what are we really expecting here? Regardless of the musical side of Gen 1, it's fine. In terms of quality, what, maybe only 2 tracks truly stand out among mid? Luckily for the soundtrack though, it's nothing short of iconic to make up for it, boasting arguably one of the most iconic pieces of video game music ever. But regardless, that's it for this section. Let's just go make fun of this game's story already. For the first set of Pokemon games, they may as well not even have a narrative at all. You may ask why, but the simple fact I can summarize it as simply as, hey, your adventure begins, you get mons and are tasked with completing the Pokedex that you in fact will never do, but you go collect badges and accidentally stop a criminal organization along the way, all while crushing the hopes and dreams of your rival in your quest to become number 1, and some guy becomes a Pokemon along the way, while you even vanquish a soul that is too angry to die. For a bonus in the case of Yellow, there's 2 extra characters injected to the game to provide, get this, nothing. But yeah, that's it. Quite literally all of it minus some lore stuff. Like, what is the point? Look, it's fine that the game doesn't have a genuine story. It doesn't really need it. Mainly because the game isn't being brought to a crawl constantly to waste your time with bad plot to an unbearable degree, like other games may do. So hey, at least they got that part right. Anyways, hey look, nothing. That means I guess it's time to close this video out. That sucks. That's a sad note to end this on. At the end of the line, the Generation 1 Pokemon games are nothing short of a product of their time. Red and Blue are games of nostalgia, setting a very barren foundation to build upon, kickstarting a series of absolutely questionable quality, but undoubtable enjoyment. The games themselves are just a lovely mess. Flawed beyond words, but they're beautiful for their flaws. Yellow, on the other hand, is just a mediocre game of novelty that was completely unneeded. An idea that was poorly implemented, featuring changes to the core experience that make the game worse to come back between the 2 versions. You know, levels, teams, making it pretty much worthless for a repeat run if a choice between the 2 even exists. When it comes to the question of whether you should play either of these games, the answers will actually remain unchanged. Red and Blue is a yes, primarily just from being where it all started, and being arguably one of the better ways to experience the older stages of Pokemon, you know, between generations 1 and 2, while just generally being more tolerable than Yellow. Which, that game, just a hard no. Between being the third deproved version of a set, having its own spiritual remakes, alongside the winner between this set of games also having its own remakes, this headache has next to nothing of value to let it stand out whatsoever. No, not even the old game excuse either. In terms of quality of the games on a tier list though, Yellow is the same, and Red and Blue have rightfully dropped to 2 stars. The only difference this time rather than last time is obviously ranking its quality accurate to everything else there, and not making up a hypothetical good for its time thing, but rather through the perspective of modern day. And unfortunately, these games just suffer from the bar rising over the past 25 plus years of gaming since release. They've not aged well in the slightest, which is typically a good thing because it does show positive progression series-wise, even if a lot of the games feel like they're finally getting there. Which leaves us with the opinions of the voice that may as well live rent-free in your head. And for me, one of these games is fine, and the other one's just not fun in the slightest, as you can tell. Generally speaking, my opinions on Red and Blue don't really go anywhere past, wow man, it sure is a game and a grind, leaving the game itself to be something I'd never really think about. That would be the case though if I didn't make that fatal mistake in my first video on the topic with that terrible, oh but for the time perspective, and not holding it true for everything else to follow. But now, it's at a rest. And for Yellow, I still have my personal distaste for the game. Obviously that much hasn't changed at all, just being a drag that feels inferior in terms of its experience from start to finish, even despite my gripes with Crystal existing, feeling like a copy and paste but changing it ever so slightly so the teacher might not catch you plagiarizing Wikipedia and still failing, is infinitely better than taking something and just making it worse. Regardless gamers, that's it for today. A trip down one of what I would say is correcting one of my worst videos and kind of repurposing one that just had the issue of not looking yellow enough. And this one's still not looking yellow enough. I swear it looked fine at first. Although now, I am satisfied, which is one thing to be thankful for, I suppose. Meaning it's time to bid farewell. So as always, thank you for watching, and until next time. Wait, what even is next time? Oh, well that's not pleasant at all.